The desert east of Holbrook looks from a distance like a field of embers cooling after a long fire. You don't smell smoke, you smell creosote and dust. But the colors burn. Agate reds, iron oranges, chalcedony blues kept quiet under sun. That July, the heat came early and stayed late, hammering the horizon flat. Trucks droned on I-40, freight trains shouldered their way through with a bass note that reached the bones. On a pullout that had once been a homestead, the Field School of Paleoecology from the State University fanned out with backpacks, flagging tape, and the particular optimism of people who believe time can be persuaded to talk. Dr. Elena Ruiz had been here before as a grad student when photographs were still developed in trays. Now she was the one carrying the permit and the responsibility. The site wasn't a secret. Not exactly, but it also wasn't on the park's signed trails. A cattle fence sagged and straightened across the plain. An arroyo, locals called it Dog Kill Wash, for reasons no one agreed on, broke the land into a careful puzzle. In the washbank, rain had gnawed back just enough to expose the cross-sections. Wood grain frozen into quartz, growth rings like whispers. An ancient forest turned to stone, not as dramatic as lava or as tidy as fossils in limestone, but a patient miracle of silica, moving through dead wood until wood became memory, hardened. With Elena were Maya Singh, who never met a data set she didn't want to adopt, Tom Larkin, a structural geologist whose sun hat had one corner chewed by his dog, and Ranger Ben Yazzie, who had grown up south of here and had the manner of a man who'd measured his life against the length of this sky. Ben didn't talk unless he needed to. When he did, the words landed where they were sent. They laid out a grid. They mapped orientation of the logs. They noted the way the limbs, long gone, had left the faintest of negative spaces in the silica. Dogkill Wash had cut a fresh scarp, beautiful, dangerous, and water had sorted chunks of the fossil wood as if it were still persuadable, rolling smaller pieces downstream and leaving the big ones stranded like beached whales. Look at this one. Elena squatted beside a trunk whose bark, translated into stone, still kept its ridges. Archaeologists, Triassic, 220 million years and change. She brushed sand from a fracture line. No modern tree does this in this setting, not like this. They flagged a dozen logs for photogrammetry. Maya set up her drone and took the kind of overlapping images that would later become a three-dimensional model. Tom tapped a chisel against a loose chip, frowned at the ring count as if time had cheated him personally, and took notes in a field book he kept wrapped in a sandwich bag. Ben watched the sky, and when the anvil cloud raised its shoulders over the blue mesa, he said, "Pack up!" He didn't raise his voice. The others didn't argue. In the desert, distance lies. That storm marked them before they decided whether to be dignified or quick. By dusk, they had the truck pointed out, tires light on the two-track, a cool wind pushing up from the south. "Monsoon's early," Tom said, which was a way of saying get home. In Holbrook, the smell of wet asphalt confused the smells of fry bread and diesel. Elena stood under the motel awning, watching sheets of rain draw and redraw the margins of the parking lot. The power blinked once, twice, and settled. Over the ridge beyond the petrified forest boundary, lightning stitched the horizon. It was beautiful because they were not in it. It was dangerous because beauty in this country is not a compliment, it's a warning. They went back 2 days later, the roads scabbed and the ground not so much dry as determined to pretend it had never been mud. Ben drove. "Gates are down," he said, and stopped to lift them. The barbed wire scarred and shiny where hands had made decisions often. At Dogkill Wash, the bank had lost 6 inches, as if someone had taken a careful bite from a cake. Driftwood, not fossil, but modern cottonwood sacrificed a county away, was jammed in the culvert like a beaver's bad day. "Something's odd," Maya said softly. Elena saw it then and found she did not want to announce the fact. A trunk she had logged as Grid D4, lying with its butt to the west and its crown to the east, now pointed north. not by degrees, but by certainty. The flagging tape stood where she had tied it, but the log had pivoted a quarter of a turn and slid not less than 3 feet. The sand under it had skated smooth. "You sure?" Tom said defensively, as if the earth had insulted his training. He checked the photos on Maya's tablet, squinting against glare. The before and after were not subtle. The log had been here. Now it was there. A boy could have rolled a baseball under it. You could see the groove. "It's heavy," Maya said, as if weight could be persuaded to respect embarrassment. "Not as heavy as a river that's lost its manners," Ben said. He squatted, ran 2 fingers through the sand, found where the grains sorted by size. "We got a storm, and then a pressure drop. Water ponded upstream of the culvert, then released all at once. The bed liquefied, didn't need much slope to carry something if the bottom turned to soap." Elena nodded, not convinced, but committed to reason. They walked the grid. Grid E2 had a smaller log that had inched uphill, a thing gravity is loath to admit, and yet does when water leaves a bed like a tray slipping out from under marbles. At F1 there were shallow tracks, a scrabble, a drag, then boot prints. Not theirs. Ben touched the disturbed sand with the back of his hand. "Night," he said. "Maybe last night. 2 or 3 people. Small truck." He walked to where the 2-track bent behind a knoll and found a spot where tires had spun more than they ought to. "Poachers," he said without drama. Elena had read the reports. Fossil wood went for cash in roadside shops and online catalogues dressed up as heritage. Most thefts were little, a backpack's worth, a glove box trophy, but sometimes men came with crowbars and bottle jacks and a kind of boldness that tasted like contempt. In the months after big storms, the thefts spiked. Wood moved, patrols thinned. People thought the land's confusion excused their revision. They put out camera traps, old hunters' models with infrared that turned everything into winter, and noted the angles. Maya made herself small in the truck bed, calibrating lenses. Tom wanted to stay and watch, but Ben said, "Don't tell thieves what you want. Tell them nothing." They drove out under a sky that had regained its appetite. In town, a man at the diner asked if they were the rock people, and when Elena said yes, he told them his grandfather used to say he could hear the logs groan at night, shifting like old men in their sleep. He laughed to show he didn't believe his own story. Elena laughed with him and looked away. She didn't believe it either. But that night, lying in the motel with the air conditioner offering the same white noise as a distant river, she dreamed the washbank reasoned with her in a language of slips and angles, and she woke with dust in her mouth and the certainty that someone, or something, had been at work while the town slept. The next morning, Ben texted one sentence only: "North camera caught motion, 02.17. They met at the ranger station where the coffee pot had learned patience. On the laptop, the sequence bloomed in grey, the log in D4, the flatness of desert night, a halo of cold around the ground where water still sulked. Then, a shape, low, purposeful, not an animal, a human with a headlamp cupped in his hand to keep the beam narrow. Another behind him, a third lagging, the way men lag when they are there for the money and not the belief. The first man set a jack under the log, cranked. The second worked a bar. The third kept looking left at something off camera, as if he expected company. The log lifted a finger's width and slid. The men grunted, not loudly. The jack tipped. The log thudded down. The men froze and listened to nothing. Then, as if rehearsed, they gave up on lifting and pushed on the butt, rocking it like a stubborn appliance, until gravity found a new story to tell. The camera ended at the moment a second headlamp flared behind them, and the men slipped, turned, and moved out of frame fast. "What's that second light?" Maya whispered, as if they could hear her. Ben did not answer. He rewound the clip and pointed with a pencil. The second light didn't bounce like a man's, didn't narrow with a cupped hand. It flared and died and left an afterimage like lightning does when your eyelids aren't quick. It came from the direction of the culvert, where the storm had stressed old iron. Elena leaned in, saw the same, and felt the story reassemble. Water, thieves, and something mechanical failing or waking at precisely the worst time. By noon, they had a plan. Leave the cameras, add one more on the culvert, make the rounds at odd hours, talk to the roadside shops that bought stones with histories and sold them with names. "People say the forest moves at night," the Dynaman had said. Elena thought, sometimes it does, but not because mystery insists, because water negotiates, because men intervene, because a land with fossils needs more friends than it currently has. Before sunset, she walked the grid alone. The heat held its breath. A raven threw its hook-shaped shadow over her notebook and mocked the dimensions of human concern. At D4, she palmed the log, feeling the cold stored in stone. The old tree translated into something that didn't rot, but did yield to pressure and gravity and time. Across the wash, a freight train took the curve with that long iron moan. The tracks lay a quarter-mile north. The sound arrived like a rumor in a small town. Elena stood there long enough to know she would be standing there again, and that whatever had made the log move, water or men or both, would not be satisfied with a single night's work. They returned to the site with a ranger's rhythm, which is to say unpredictable on purpose. The cameras took what they were given, coyotes trotting like they had somewhere to be and were late, kangaroo rats flattering themselves that they were alone, a javelina pausing to dispute its reflection in the lens, and twice, men. The first time, 3 nights after the big storm, the men staged an experiment too careful for chance. They brought a come-along, a hand winch you use when you can't persuade an engine to help, and the kind of quiet that comes from practice. They worked no faster than the moon. The jack lifted, the bar pried, the log edged. Then from the culvert, the second light flared again, not exactly light, but the corona of something electrical that wanted to be, and then ceased. The men held still. One shone his lamp toward the concrete mouth, considered the geometry, and turned back to the work. The camera caught the face of one of them, narrow, long hair under a cap, a mole on his cheek that would be a fingerprint if anyone needed one. The second time, another storm had sugared the site with a dermis of mud that made every footstep a confession. The men didn't come, but the log in E2 had migrated 5 inches against slope again. No human tracks, no jack marks, just a slick underlayment that told the story plain: liquefaction. Tom ran a hand through his beard. "We say the ground is solid or not," he said. "But really it's a temper. Today it's agreeable. Tonight it remembers being water." Ben spent the afternoon at the roadside rows of shops that sold jasper hearts and agate bookends, and, if you knew how to ask, slices of limb cast that hadn't been purchased at any legal auction. He spoke in a tone that did not accuse. 2 owners said all their stock was old. One said his nephew picked up a few pieces on the open land, which is what thieves call public property they use like a spur track for their pockets. Ben did not threaten. He let the facts stand on their feet until they learned to walk into the man's conscience. He took photos. He left. Meanwhile, Maya pulled the last frames from the culvert camera and slowed them until the motion lay down and behaved. There, a spark at the lip of the corrugated metal, a stitch of light that ran along rust like a fuse. Not lightning, not a headlamp. The control box mounted on the fence post above the culvert hummed when you put your hand on it, and it hummed on no schedule any human had arranged. "What is that?" Elena asked. "We didn't see any power out here." "You wouldn't," Tom said. "Cathodic protection." He tapped the corrugation. "Pipes. Maybe that culvert ties into an old drainage with a protective current to keep it from rotting. Or somebody left a solar trickle charger on a sensor they forgot to log. Either way, you get stray current with moisture, you get weirdness. Enough to fire a corona, enough to buzz if you're close and tuned to it." "Could stray current do anything to the sand?" Maya asked, ever unwilling to leave a rock unturned. "Not unless we get into electro-osmosis," Tom said dryly. Water'll move under a potential, but not enough to explain our logs. The water and slope are the main actors. Electricity is the side character that makes the set shimmer. After dark, they set a blind on the ridge where the wind came clean. Ben brought a thermos that tasted like boiled determination. Elena brought patience and a notebook she'd used in 3 basins and 2 languages. Maya brought her phone because she was young, and her sister in Phoenix had a baby due, and it felt wrong to be off the grid when a new person was trying to find the way in. Tom brought his body, which stiffened in night air faster than he admitted. Before midnight, the wind lay down, and crickets took the shift. Every few minutes, a long tone from the interstate or the train line threaded the night like a seam. Elena found herself counting the seconds between horn and wheel rumble, as if triangulation would make the land behave. At 01:58, a sound like a carving ice shelf popped from the scarp, dry, severe, the stick slip of sand losing its courage. Ben touched Elena's arm. There, in the infrared, the world turned lunar. The log at D4 shifted a degree, then another, like a man rolling to relieve a joint. No hands, no feet. The sand under the downslope side had liquefied enough to permit motion. The upslope side had found purchase on clay that had not yet remembered it was slick. The log pivoted about a point where an old limb had once been, and now was a silica knot acting as a hitch. The move took 20 minutes. At the end, the log's butt rested in a new groove an inch deep. If you'd come at dawn, you would have said the camera lied. "There's your moving forest," Tom said, "the kind of man who needs to say what is already true to make room for the next truth." Eleanor exhaled, surprised by relief, disappointed there was no need to invoke mystery, grateful there was proof to teach with. "And the men?" she asked. "Watch the east," Ben murmured. 02:17. Footsteps. Not careful this time, they were in a hurry. 2 came first, headlamps high without shame. The third lagged again, the man with the mole. He carried something cloth-wrapped, a slice maybe, cut somewhere else and brought to sell as a drama here. Ben's breath changed. Elena did not look. In the blind, night and waiting can make adrenaline wear a clergyman's collar and call itself prudence. Ben touched his radio, squeezed once, let it go. Headlights crawled over the far knoll, not from their party. Another ranger truck, driven without noise. A second unit blocked the 2-track like a polite no. Ben rose in a fluent motion, made no show, and walked toward the men as if he were delivering bread. They froze for one of those seconds that stretches like taffy when consequence introduces itself. The man with the mole dropped his bundle. One ran left and found only sage. One stepped backward and met the barbed wire's memory. The third lifted his hands like he was asking permission from air. Ben's voice stayed level. Other voices, familiar ranger tones, answered. There are moments in the desert when the land gets to be the grown-up in the room. This was one. By dawn, 3 men had learned what federal charges feel like, and Elena had learned again that mystery in this country is never singular. The logs moved by physics, the thieves moved by habit and hunger dressed as hustle. The culvert blinked by neglect. The train's song stitched a night that did not care who owned which pride. At the station, the men were less defiant than Elena expected. The youngest, mole on cheek, said, "It's just rocks, ma'am." He was 20, maybe. He spoke without meanness. He spoke like a man who has never had to assign a name to deep time. Elena didn't lecture. You don't pour oceans into thimbles. She said, "That log grew when this land was wet and had teeth. The tree died, and water fed it again from the inside out until it was stone. 200 million years is not a pile, it's a story. You don't steal stories from the dead to buy a new muffler." He shrugged, not to be cruel, but to save his face from the heat of shame. Ben wrote a report. Tom drank his coffee in a silence that wasn't empty. Maya texted her sister, delivered, a girl, 7 pounds, and cried, and when Ben glanced over, she said, "Life keeps happening no matter what we're measuring." "Good," he said. They went back to the wash one more time before sleeping. The sun made a shallow angle, colour sneaking back into a land that had been monochrome for 12 hours. The groove under D4 caught the light like a scar. Elena laid her palm on the log and felt only cool. She thought of the Dynaman's grandfather hearing groans. You could call them sounds. You could call them the earth adjusting its posture. The cameras came down. The signs went up. A realignment of the culvert scheduled. A note to maintenance about stray current. A patrol roster that would keep the thieves from deciding the night belonged to them. Elena took with her the maps and the images and a story she could tell without shame. The forest moved at night and she could show you how. Chapter 3. The exhibit, the letter, and the waystone teaches patience. Summer burned off in a wind that set flags on pickups to their loudest setting. The field school wrapped, the lab reopened, the semester arrived with its cupboard of clean notebooks. In the basement of the Uni's Natural History Museum, Elena and Maya set D4's model on a rotating plinth, like a cake of time. Tom went home to Flagstaff, where he liked to pretend he was retired until rocks begged for comment. Ben returned to his roots, the radio crackle resuming its place as a companionable nuisance. The exhibit, Forest of Time, How Wood Becomes Stone, didn't try to be clever. It put a slab of limb cast under light and let the ring count tell a story anyone's knuckle could measure. It set a touchscreen beside the model and let visitors scrub between before and after, storm day and still day, so they could watch the log pivot its careful quarter turn. A video played on loop. Maya narrating with a voice that young parents trusted, Ben explaining liquefaction without the word, Tom gesturing with his hands to make invisible water move. Elena had written the panel text with a pen she'd owned since grad school. Verbs clean, adjectives rationed. In the corner a small monitor ran the infrared clip, but they cropped it so you saw only the log and the flare at the culvert. The men were not the first act, they were a subplot. The caption read, "Storms make the ground a stranger to itself. Heavy objects, temporarily freed, can settle into new positions. You may hear stories that the forest moves at night. It does, by water and time." On opening day, the museum gave out popsicles because Phoenix had opinions about September. Older visitors came first, the ones who read every panel and frowned at inconsistencies without announcing them. A man in a Vietnam veteran's cap stood at the infrared clip for a full cycle and said, to no one in particular, "Seen land do worse in less weather." A woman with a teacher's posture stood with her granddaughter and explained that petrified didn't mean scared. It meant changed molecule by molecule until identity is an argument you have with your own past. At noon, a county sheriff's deputy wandered in. Young, tight haircut, hands that twitched like they were used to carrying correspondence between danger and relief. He nodded at Elena. "You the one wrote the text?" She said yes. He said, "It's plain. That's hard to do." It was the highest praise she got that day. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the museum, postmarked Winslow, addressed in a large, careful hand. Inside, a lined page, torn from a composition book, held a pencil apology. "Ma'am, I think I was the one in your video. I didn't know there'd be a video. I was stupid, but not mean. My uncle showed me how to cut and said it was like getting pecans out of a yard tree. I don't want to be that anymore. I don't have money, but I have time. If there's a way to help you that isn't just saying sorry, tell me. J.M." Eleanor read it twice and felt the particular ache of a teacher who has been offered a beginner's mind lightly salted with guilt. She wrote back. She did not preach, she said. "Come on Saturdays. We do public days with kids. You can carry tripods, tell the story of the storm, explain why what looks dead still is not done with its errands, bring water, wear a hat." He came. He was the mole-cheeked boy, but less a boy now that he'd chosen a sentence that had no judge behind it. He showed a 6-year-old how to see growth rings with a fingertip. He didn't mention the arrest. He didn't have to. In October, the Bureau's maintenance crew came out to Dogkill Wash with a backhoe and an electrician who talked to the culvert as if it were a stubborn uncle. They tied off the stray current, rerouted the sensor, trimmed sage to make camera sightlines cleaner. In the wash, the scarp had healed some of its sharpness. The groove under D4 had softened like a scab remembered by skin, but no longer annoyed by air. Ben stood with a clipboard and watched men in hard hats do the kind of work that ensures nothing happens, which is the hardest kind of work to fund. New storms came. The logs moved a little again, as they always would when physics insisted, but now the story had honest language. The roadside shops, after a few visits, decided it was less trouble to sell legal slices than to endure a ranger's monthly eyebrows. The park added a line to their brochure. Please leave the wood where it rests. The story is bigger than your shelf. People mostly listened. In November, Elena drove out alone, because you are allowed your own company in the places that taught you your shape. She took the long way through Joseph City, where the wind rearranged signs for its own amusement. At the wash, the air was a transparency, so dry the horizon sounded like paper. She sat on the bank with her notebook and did what she had done at 25, and had promised herself she would still be doing at 55. Watch. The desert listened back. A raven reported the news. A beetle made a decision about shade. Far off, the train wailed its progress. Elena put her hand on D4 and felt cool because it was morning. Warmth would come. She remembered the Dynaman's joke about logs groaning. She thought, if you listen at night and hear the land shift, it is not magic. It is motion catching up with permission. The wash lets go, the slope invites, the log accepts. The thieves, when there are thieves, are just a louder version of the same urge. At her back, footsteps. Ben came up the wash with the gait of someone who wanted to startle no one. Thought I'd find you here, he said. He handed her a coffee that had decided at some point in the drive to become good. We got a call last week, he added. Lady said she saw logs moving under the full moon. Turned out it was her shadow when she walked with a flashlight. We all want a legend. We got one, Elena said. It's just less cinematic, he grinned. You gonna tell it anyway? Every time I'm asked, she paused. And sometimes when I'm not, he nodded. I'll keep the cameras up through winter. Trains push weird pressure waves when the air's cold. You'll get a few more degrees of pivot in January. Look at us, she said, smiling at the habit of measurement that journalists sometimes called joyless, and which, to her, had always been joy. Predicting angles like weather. They stood a while, saying nothing anyone needed to annotate. A coyote trotted along the far bank, stopped, looked at them, adjusted its story of them, and moved on. Overhead, the sky put on a blue that made painters swear. Back at the museum, during the holiday open house, Elena fussed with labels and watched the traffic. Grandparents who read every word. Teenagers who took selfies with a Triassic trunk, as if they were including an ancestor in the frame. A couple in their 60s arguing amiably about whether a picture of a log counts as a tree or a rock for the purposes of her bingo card. Maya arrived late, hair down, baby niece on her hip, and told Eleanor she was moving to Holbrook for a year to work the new citizen science program, helping locals set up trail cameras and file reports that didn't need to be dramatized to be loved. Near the exit, a small placard invited visitors to sit with the slideshow of the wash at night. No soundtrack. The room darkened. The infrared palette made mammals into ghosts and stone into cotton. Then, frame by frame, D4 rotated that dignified incremental quarter turn, and if you stayed long enough, you watched water and sand and gravity do what they have done without applause since before we learned to clap. In the last frame, the log had come to rest. A line of text faded in. At night the ancient forest moves, not to haunt you, but to remind you that everything that looks finished is still negotiating with time. People read it, and sometimes reached for a hand. You could see them remember floods, slow landslides, the day the dresser shifted a quarter inch on the hardwood with no one touching it because humidity had opinions. The older ones nodded. Above 55, you know about moving without anyone seeing you try. A week before the exhibit closed for maintenance, a package arrived, no return address. Inside, wrapped in a dish towel with daisies, lay a polished slice of petrified wood, the color of good steak. Alongside it, a note, found this at a yard sale. Thought it belonged to no one, realized it belongs to everyone. Please use it to teach. A friend. Elena showed it to Ben, who raised his eyebrows in the exact way you raise eyebrows when the world does something correct without being asked. They inscribed the slice on the underside, donated anonymously 2025, and placed it under glass beside D4's model. It caught light like a small, dignified promise. On the last day, after the last popsicle and the last kind question about how long water takes to make a forest stone, Elena turned off the monitor and stood once more before the image of the wash. She thought of the boy with the mole, who now told children the difference between stealing and studying. She thought of the Dynaman's grandfather, who had given the desert a voice so he could bear the sound of it becoming something else. She thought of leagues of time under her feet, and of the small inches into which a human life is parcelled, and of the way stone moves when given the patience and the pitch. Then she locked the gallery, walked out into the heat with its honest hand on her chest, and felt the ground be what it has always been, firm, persuasive, and about to change.